Good morning, my name's Eric Lambert. This is our third video that we're doing on the Temple Project. Temple Project is the name of the first video, and that second one will be the Temple 2 Project, and this is the Temple 3 Project, third video. And we'll talk about why, in this video, talk about why Christians need to be interested in helping the Jews rebuild the temple. Of late, it has become a controversial issue, and people are calling names, and they think that people like me and others are abandoning the faith and dabbling in things we shouldn't dabble in as believers in Jesus. However, I'd like to show you where the scriptures guide us in this area, guided people in the past and are guiding us now. Just like in the 19th century, Christians tried to help the Jews get back to Israel, get back to the land of Palestine. And they were Christian Zionists. So in a sense, we're continuing that tradition of Christian Zionism and trying to help the Jews and support the Jews in their attempt to rebuild the temple. The first two videos showed where the temple should be located. We're not trying to build on the Temple Mount, not the traditional Temple Mount. We're not trying to build there. We think that's where the Roman fort was, and it would be a lot easier down the hill at the correct spot to build the temple. The Jews must build at the correct spot. They can't just build anywhere. They have to build at the correct spot. And then in the first two videos, we showed why the correct spot was south of the traditional Temple Mount. But now we need to say to Christians, why should you be interested? Why is this something you need? Jesus is our last and final sacrifice. We don't need another sacrifice. So aren't you violating the New Testament by trying to do this? And I'd like to disabuse you of that notion, if that's your notion, or help you understand a little bit better. This is nothing fancy, just some scriptures that I'd like to talk about. Daniel chapter 8. In Daniel we find different prophecies, and you could line them up in columns next to each other, and they match. Different visions, different prophecies that he had, but they all end with the death of the Antichrist, the destruction of the evil kingdom, and the return of the Messiah. So that seems to be a theme, and when God repeats himself, he usually wants us to take him very seriously. So we see that done in the books of the Kings, we see it done in the Gospels, and we see it done here in Daniel, the 4 or 5 different visions that he has. So in Daniel chapter 8, he talks about the Antichrist desecrating the temple. When you read through this, if you're really getting into the study, you feel with him that truth is thrown to the ground. And you have this sinking feeling. He's talking about the future temple. He says this is God's sanctuary. It is his sanctuary. And truth is thrown to the ground. The sacrifices are stopped, and his sanctuary is desecrated. Now, some people think this happened in the 160s BC with Antiochus Epiphanes, one of the Greek kingdoms left over after Alexander the Great. However, if you follow Daniel, Daniel has a vision of 69 and then 77s, 69 followed by the 70th 7. And if you follow those people and what they're talking about, you would have to count those 69 and then the 70th 7 this way: 65, 66, 67, 68, 70, and then 69. It messes up the order that anyone can count. So we don't want to put the destruction of the temple, desecration of the temple, back almost 200 years before Jesus, because the way he prophesies is Jesus has to come, the Messiah shows up, he's cut off, and then the final 70th 7 will take place. But first is the death of the Messiah. So if you put this before Jesus, then you're mixing up the numbers and the order of those numbers. So we want to be careful with this and not jump ahead and say, well, he's obviously talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. In fact, the origin of that idea really comes from people saying that Daniel wasn't prophesying. It comes from liberals who say, we don't believe in prophecy, so Daniel's really written after Antiochus Epiphanes, and he wrote it like it was a prophecy, but it wasn't one. So he faked it. So that's where that originally comes from. Now, some people get confused, and they're honest and good people, but that's confusing the numbers of Daniel. So he's still talking about a future sanctuary because he says this belongs to the time of the end, or the distant future. Those are his words. So we know it's not Antiochus Epiphanes, but rather something that hasn't even happened yet. Jesus himself in Matthew 24 talks about this same thing that Daniel talked about. In fact, I saw a video presentation recently, very famous Bible scholar, and he says, we're going to talk about Jesus. We're going to talk about what he thought about the end times, but we're not going to talk about Daniel. Now, I really thought that was strange, since Jesus himself says in Matthew 24, this is what Daniel talked about. And then he goes into the same thing, the abomination of desolation, desecration of the temple, run for the hills, get out of Dodge before all these things happen. Pray you're not pregnant, or it's on a Sabbath, or in the wintertime, because it's the greatest tribulation ever. So it hasn't happened yet. Jesus is looking to the future. Some people say, well, wait a minute, this must have been when the Romans came and destroyed the temple. The problem is it didn't happen when the Romans came. Josephus goes out of his way to say Titus really tried to preserve the temple. There was no desecration in the sense of what even the Maccabees experienced with Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes did things we won't say on the video in the temple sanctuary. That's a desecration, but it's not what Daniel's talking about. And the Romans really tried hard not to burn the temple. It was kind of an accident. Torch through one of the windows down behind the paneling, and the whole thing went up. But they did save a lot of the things from the temple, took them out before they could burn, and they brought out the menorah, and the menorah moves around in history. It's a very interesting subject. Anyway, Jesus calls this the holy place, and so he looks at it as a holy thing, even though it's something in the distant future. So Jesus talks about that. It's not the Romans. It hasn't happened yet. Then the next one that we talk about is God's temple. And Paul says in 2 Thessalonians that this future temple that will be desecrated by the Antichrist is God's temple. I mean, who am I to say no, it's not God's temple? Of course it is. That's what Paul says. And so we know it's still the future. Now, this is written before the Romans, but Revelation is written after the 70 AD event with the Romans. And it's written toward the end of the first century in the 90s. And Revelation 11 calls it the temple of God. So he's still predicting into the future something that's going to happen in the future with the temple of God. So this is a very deep subject. We don't have time to do the rabbit trails. We don't have time to follow them all down. But we do know Matthew 24 and Luke 21 are parallel passages. In other words, in one passage in Matthew, Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation, run for the hills. Don't be pregnant. Don't pray you're not pregnant women, and on a Sabbath and in the winter, run. But Luke says the same thing, and it's the same speech on the Mount of Olives, but he says, when you see the city surrounded by armies. And so everybody says, aha, that's the Romans. They surrounded the city, and Christians got out before the Romans came. And that must be the interpretation, but it absolutely is not. It is the same passage as Matthew 24, and there is no abomination of desolation in that scenario with the Romans. So the surrounding of the city is actually pretty interesting, because in the Old Testament, Zechariah predicts the city surrounded right before the return of the Messiah. So it's still in the future. It's not the Romans. Also, people say, well, it was the Roman times, they surrounded the city in 70 AD, destroyed the city, and then the times of the Gentiles. That's what Luke says, the times of the Gentiles started. But remember the repetition. Revelation repeats the time of the Gentiles is only 3.5 years. It's only 3.5 years long. So I can't explain it just except to say that God repeats himself so that we don't make a mistake. All of this is still in the future, and we know that for sure. Daniel talked about that final 70th 7 years. And in the middle, the Antichrist breaks his covenant. And so 3.5 on one side, 3.5 on the other side. But then John in Revelation is still repeating those numbers. So Daniel can say about the 3.5 on one side, a time, and then a double word, times, and then a half a time, 3.5. That's the same thing that happens in John. He talks about a time, a times, and a half a time, 3.5. He says 1,260 days, 1,260 days. In lunar years, that's 7 years. 42 months and 42 months, that's 7 years. half of 7, 3.5. It all works. It all fits. It's all in the future. It hasn't happened yet. And to struggle to make it happen sometimes leaves you in a funny position of saying that Jesus stopped the sacrifices in the 70th 7, when that's really the role of the Antichrist, not Jesus. And so I'm sure you've heard your whole life, just like me, that Jesus' ministry was 3.5 years, trying to match what Daniel said. That is not the case. His ministry was a lot longer than 3.5 years, but they're trying to force it into Daniel's prophecy of those 3.5 years. So it doesn't work like that. Jesus doesn't stop the sacrifices like the Antichrist does. That's his job, not Jesus' job. So we see it as completely in the future. We also notice in Daniel chapter 8 that this sanctuary is going to be reconsecrated. Now again, people say, well, that was when the Maccabees came along and they pushed out the Greeks and they reconsecrated the temple, but that's not the case. This sanctuary is still in the distant future. It is talking about the Messiah doing this. So who is the only one that could reconsecrate the sanctuary after the Antichrist? That's Jesus. He's returned. He's destroyed the Antichrist. The Messiah has come, and that's the end. The sanctuary is used during his millennial reign. So it's very clear if you put all of these things together. The sanctuary will be reconsecrated. And that comes in with the study of Ezekiel. Ezekiel talks about this future temple. And he gives dimensions for it that people struggle with. But he gave dimensions for the altar in the temple that are different from Solomon's dimensions. And the sons of the exile, as Maimonides calls them, the people, the Jews that come back from Babylonian captivity, they actually build the altar for their new temple on the scale that Ezekiel talks about. So they're looking forward to this temple. They can't do it. They can't build a big one, but they can at least do the altar itself. Interestingly, they dedicate the altar at the Feast of Tabernacles. Solomon dedicated his temple at the Feast of Tabernacles. When the Maccabees were running from the Greeks, they missed their favorite holiday. Their favorite holiday was the Feast of Tabernacles. It is, by Josephus standards, the highest and holiest event in on the Jewish calendar. So they were running from the Greeks. They couldn't do it, so they got back. They cleansed the temple, and then they rededicated it, and they called it the Winter Feast of the Tabernacles. But I relate this to soldiers in the United States Army coming home in July, but they missed Christmas. So you have Christmas in July. That's what they did. They missed their highest and holiest celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, and so they did another one when they dedicated the temple. So all these different times coincide with the dedication of the temple in some way, the Feast of Tabernacles. So Zechariah comes along, chapter 14, and he says the whole world will celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. And I believe it's at the time when it's reconsecrated, the temple is reconsecrated in Jerusalem. So that event for 1,000 years is commemorated during the reign of Christ for that 1,000 years. Now there's something else I hope would convince you, if nothing else has. And this is so exciting. And it feeds right into Christians helping build the temple, believe it or not. So let's start with, actually let's not start with Zechariah, let's start with Jeremiah. Jeremiah chronologically comes before Zechariah. And Jeremiah is he's called the weeping prophet. He's in a sad state. The Jews have not repented. He has encouraged them to repent, but they won't do it, so the Babylonians are coming. And he says to them, basically his message is a hard one. And God makes his forehead like flint. He has to be strong in front of all these very strong-willed people. He tells them, if you surrender to the Babylonians, you will live. If you do not surrender, you will die. And that's a hard message to give to your compatriots. And he was thrown in prison, thrown in a muddy cistern. He was abused and so on, but he survives. So during his time, he gives this prophecy in chapter 23. The branch, which is another name for the Messiah, will be called the Lord our righteousness. We'll come back to that, but I just want you to notice the Messiah's name is the Lord our righteousness. Now, during the days of Jeremiah, there was a high priest. The high priest's name was Seraiah. Now, when the Babylonians break through the walls, they capture the high officials and they capture the high priest Seraiah. And they take him north to Riblah and they execute him before Nebuchadnezzar. But he has a son, and his son's name is Jehozadak. And Jehozadak goes into exile, and he stays away and never returns. As far as I know, he doesn't come back. They stay in exile 70 years. But he has a son while he's in exile, and Jehozadak's son's name is Joshua. So Joshua, the high priest. He comes back with Ezra, he comes back with, he's in Nehemiah, and so on. They all know him, and Zechariah. So Zechariah is saying to the people, here is the man whose name is the branch. And now the scenario is this. He calls in the high priest, Joshua, and he calls Zerubbabel, and he gets all the people there, and he's told to take an offering of gold and silver. And he fashions a crown, and he puts it on the head of Joshua, the high priest. Now, this is simply not done. There's a separation between the priesthood and the kings. The kings must come from Judah, the son of David. Zerubbabel, who's along with them down on, to rebuild the temple, Zerubbabel is the governor. He's the son of David. So instead of putting the crown on his head, he puts it on the head of the high priest, and he says, here is the man whose name is the Messiah, or the branch, another name for the Messiah. Here is the man whose name, not the man. The man is not the Messiah, but it's his name that is the Messiah. What's his name? His name is Joshua. Some of you may know where I'm going with this. I said to a rabbi one time, I was the chaplain in the army. There was a rabbi 2 ranks above me. He was the chaplain, and I said, sir, you know, your Bible predicts the name of the Messiah, and his name is Jesus. He said, absolutely not, it doesn't say that. And I said, well, let's look. And so we turned in his Hebrew Bible, so I had to gulp a little bit because I don't read Hebrew. And he turned to Zechariah 6. And at the top of the page was a paragraph that talked about Zechariah saying these things. And then around it were very famous commentators. And these commentators all said, he read it for me, and he said, oh, yeah, he says, let me read what they say. And he read it, and he said, they all say he, that is Zechariah, made a mistake. He shouldn't have put the crown on the head of the high priest. He should have put it on the head of Zerubbabel. And I said, well, sir, you're trying to tell me I'm wrong based on the fact you're calling your prophet wrong. Now, of course, that ended the conversation. But the name of this man is Joshua, and the name, the pronunciation of the name, changes to Yeshua. And so you can see in the Greek Bible that comes a couple hundred years later, when they translate this, it is Jesus in Greek. Jesus is the Greek way of saying Jesus. Yeshua is the Hebrew way of saying Jesus. Here is the man whose name is the Messiah. His name is Jesus. So what's his last name? What's his father's name? His father's name is Jehozadak. Jehozadak, Seraiah is killed. Jehozadak is now the high priest, but there's no temple, and he goes off into exile. He has a son. His name is Jehozadak. Well, what is this word right here in Jeremiah? The branch will be called Jehozadaknu. And nu is the suffix that means hour in Hebrew. So he's saying, here is the man whose name is the branch, the Lord our righteousness, Jehozadaknu. And he has a son. His name is Jesus. His name is Joshua, Yeshua, Jesus. And so Jesus, son of the Lord our righteousness, is the name of the Messiah. I mean, this is wonderful. This is fantastic. It's unbelievable. And it's not believed by the Jews. Even to this day, their commentators say he made a mistake. But it's very clear he's calling the Messiah Jesus, the Son of God. And so here's where the temple comes in. In the same chapter, Zechariah ends in chapter 6. He says, those who are far away will come help build the temple, and you will know the Lord Almighty sent me. What does he mean? He's talking to the Jews. Then you'll know that the Lord Almighty, what does that mean? Well, if you read Zechariah, you'll find that Zechariah had a lot of problems. He started out well. He helped the Jews, encouraged the Jews with his prophecies and his pronouncements to rebuild the temple. But along in the chapters, as they flow out of here after chapter 6, they come to despise him. And they kill him, according to Jesus. In the New Testament, Jesus said they killed Zechariah. Yes, right in the very temple he helped them build. Now, it sounds awful. It sounds terrible. It says it in the New Testament, but it also says it in the Jewish Mishnah. And so the Mishnah gives hints about Zechariah's horrible death and how they're punished for that. So it's in both the New Testament and also in Jewish writings. So this poor guy is not believed. And we saw it in the rabbi's Bible with the commentators. They don't believe him. They said he made a mistake, which is, I can't fathom that anybody would say that about their prophet, but the prophet made a mistake. So when those who are far away come help build the temple, you will know the Lord Almighty sent me. Okay, who are the far away? The New Testament calls Gentile Christians, you who were far away have now been brought near. So I think this is a message for us, that those who are far away will come help build so that they will believe their own prophet. It's sort of a missionary kind of a thing. So when those are far away, when Christian Gentiles come, they've been brought near by Jesus, they come help build the temple, then the Jews will begin to believe in Jesus, their Messiah, as a nation. Now, it might take some time. It will certainly happen by the end of the 70th seven of Daniel, but you get the idea. Those that are far away, that's us. And we come and help build the temple and hopefully build it in the right place, and then they will know that Zechariah was right. But to this day, they do not believe that. So, he ends this chapter by saying, this will happen if you diligently obey the Lord your God. Now, who is the you? Of course, he's addressing the Jews, but I would like to add, he's addressing us. This will happen if you, us, diligently obey the Lord our God. So we get the Jews to do this, we'll get the Christians to do this, and I think we're on the right road. We're on the road to redemption. It doesn't matter who watches this, it's going to happen whether I say it or not. So those that are far away will come help build. So let's review. Daniel starts us off with calling this future temple his sanctuary, the sanctuary of God. Jesus follows up and says, just like Daniel said it, it is the holy place. Then Paul comes along and says it is God's temple, where the Antichrist enters, says unheard of things against the God of gods, just like Daniel said. And then in Revelation, it's called the temple of God. The sanctuary is going to be reconsecrated. The Messiah's name is Jesus, Son of the Lord our righteousness, or Son of God. Zechariah says, wait for those that are far away to come help build, and then you will know, then you will believe me about the Messiah's name. And then last of all, this will happen if you diligently obey the Lord your God. The last thing we have to do is address a very serious problem. And it's a Bible interpretation problem. And that's the next page. And so I might as well turn it and we'll talk about it. I have heard for years and years and years and years, all my Christian life, that the Antichrist is a Jew. And every time some Jewish guy becomes famous, somebody gets excited and starts running around screaming, the Antichrist is here. Now, this is not true. This is anti-Semitic. This is not what the Bible says. Now, it does come from Daniel 11. It's a popular myth among Christians based on Daniel 11. But Daniel says this, that the Antichrist will not regard the God of his fathers. Well, the word God there is Elohim. Elohim's one of those special words that can be translated singular or plural. It's like the word deer. Look, there's a deer. A deer. Look at the deer. Is that one or is that 20? You don't know. It's the same kind of word for Elohim. You have to be careful with your translations. And here it says he doesn't regard the gods of his fathers, or he doesn't regard the God of his fathers. You don't know. So everybody says, well, that's a temple, and it must be singular, and it must be talking about a Jew. No. This is an antichrist person. And the temple the truth is thrown down by this man. And so it's not a Jew. It could be a Hindu. The gods of his fathers. Or it could be a Muslim. Or some people say it's a Christian. Personally, I think that the scriptures tell us that Antichrist comes from Babylonia. Not just Babylon, because everybody says, oh, Babylon means Rome. And no. It says the land of Babylonia. So you figure it out. This isn't a presentation on the Antichrist, except to say this popular myth only brings chaos. Every time somebody looks like they might be the Antichrist, somebody puts out a video. Let's calm down. Let's be sincere before the Lord. I was taught this by a very godly man, a Professor Bishop back at Washington Bible College. And he said the Antichrist is not a Jew. And this is why they're wrong. They're misunderstanding. And this is the only place you could say it says anything about his background. And it could be God's, could be God, whatever. So let's slow down. Let's stop the nonsense and stop the name calling and stop the screaming and the videos and the invectives. And let's slow down and just look at what the scriptures say. This is God's temple we're talking about. And this is our job as those that are far away to come help build it. But it's certainly called God's temple, and it's reconsecrated. So with this, that's the end of the presentation. Next time, this I hope will be labeled the Temple Project 3, number 2, Temple Project 2, and the first one that came out doesn't say any numbers, but that's where you'll find it, the Temple Project. And it's in with a bunch of other stuff when you look it up on YouTube, but you can find it that way. Hopefully you'll join us. By the summertime, Lord willing, we'll be able to say we have a foundation, we have a place to send money. Yeah, it's about money. It's a lot of money, but we're trusting God. And with that, I thank you for watching. God bless.